Welcome back, everybody, and welcome to labeling theory. So I'm going to give you general background on labeling theory before we get into the specific theorist propositions. But the main construct here is literally that when somebody breaks the law or comes into contact with the formal criminal justice system, there's an unintended impact of providing a label that you are now an arrestee, a convict, a criminal, a thief, a ex-felon, and that these labels have powerful impacts over future behavior. So the argument behind labeling theory is that the criminal justice system, rather than deterring behavior, actually anchors you to it. Once you become involved in the system and you are given a label, it's almost impossible to break free of that label. And that label will begin to dictate behavior, and it will also begin to dictate the way in which you are received or not received in society around you. So the short lesson here is that bringing people into the system, which always provides a label, is actually causing more harm than it is causing crime prevention or safety. Rough number, and this ebbs and flows over time, but roughly about 2 million people are in jail or prison on any given day. So think about the implication of that once, somebody is brought into a local jail, or if you're doing a long stint in prison, you are all labeled. You are all now given a label that will follow you everywhere you go, that arguably, according to labeling theory, will provoke future crime. So that's got a huge implication. But we need to go over to the idea that what is considered illegal or what is criminal also changes over time. That these are, according to labeling theory, socially defined constructs. That without society giving definitions of this is X is bad, X, Y, and Z are bad, LMNOP are good. Without doing that, there really is no such thing as crime, which means there really is no such thing as labels. That we give the definition of crime, and therefore we are creating the class of labels that follows that definition. According to labeling theory, things are just neutral until we say otherwise. And there are certainly examples of that in the past. So the examples that I like to give are child abuse, that up until the early 1900s, there was no such thing as child abuse. Parents owned their children, parents could beat them, parents could kill them. It was literally just the way it was. It's not until we defined this as illegal that it became a crime. Wife battering is another one. Wives, up until the early 1900s, again, were the property of their husbands. And husbands, it was legal and acceptable for centuries to beat your wife if she was disobedient or if she was defiant. That's literally where the phrase "the rule of thumb" comes from. That was, sort of the standard is, don't beat your wife with anything thicker than your thumb. That is enough to get her to be obedient, but not to kill her, right? So again, I want you to keep in mind that crime is socially constructed, right? And therefore, you can only become a labeled criminal if you're violating that social construction. And depending on where we are in history, those definitions of what is illegal versus what is not will change, which means so too will the labeled population. Marijuana is a really good example. We're in the middle of the legalization versus, decriminalization, or do we keep it illegal? Well, it depends on how we define it as to whether or not you are going to be people who use are going to be a criminal. And therefore are going to be labeled and are going to be treated differently in society. The idea here is that this theoretical framework of labeling theory strongly cautions about pulling people, in particular adolescents, into the system, because once you get that label, it is very, very hard to shake it. And the first theorist that we're going to discuss under labeling theory is a guy named Lemmert. And Lemmert defines two types of deviance, that there's primary deviance and there's secondary deviance. And primary deviance is your first interaction with crime ever. Lemmert doesn't care about primary deviance. He is not interested in trying to figure out why people engage in crime for the first time. He says it's not really relevant. It could be a blip on the radar. It could be you're curious, you didn't know you were breaking the law, or maybe you are just mischievous or naturally evil. It doesn't matter to him, right? What he is interested in is secondary deviance, which is all deviance that comes after your first criminal interaction. He argues that secondary deviance occurs largely because of the labels that are placed on people after they engage in primary deviance, meaning that you get involved in crime for the first time, you get caught, or maybe you don't get caught, but people know you're engaging in crime, and you are now labeled as bad a criminal, a delinquent, a drug dealer, a felon, a convict. And those labels come with immense social power and social control over who you are, who you become, what behaviors you engage in, and also the way society receives you. Secondary deviance focuses on that response of others to the person who has offended, right? That the people respond with stigma, and that's where the label comes from. And this stigma or this label becomes the overriding definition of who you are in life. You might be a million other things. You might be compassionate. You might be smart. You might be funny. You might be hardworking. But that label of crime or criminality or delinquent will override all other status in your life, and it will begin to dominate the way the world perceives you. And ultimately, that will have an impact on the way you will behave. So ultimately, the idea here behind labeling theory and behind what Lemert postulates is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That if people start calling you a criminal or a convict or a delinquent, and this becomes how you are identified in society, you will begin to live up to those definitions, even if you didn't prior to your primary deviance. Prior to your primary deviance, you didn't have a label. You may have never espoused those characteristics. But when everybody in society is calling you and viewing you as convict, delinquent, bad guy, drug dealer, ew, stay away, we don't want anything to do with you, that you will start to live up to those definitions, and it will create new behavior that didn't exist prior to being given that label. So, for example, the idea being here behind the self-fulfilling prophecy is that, you broke the law. Okay, maybe it was a one-off, maybe it's just a one-time thing. So I want to go get a job. I want to live, according to the law, pay my taxes, pay my bills, blah, blah, blah. But now I can't get a job because I have this label. I have this label of convict. I have this label of thief. I have this label of criminal, drug dealer, untrustworthy, and therefore people won't hire me. Right? It also is going to limit my engagements and who will accept me versus who won't accept me. Obviously, people with similar labels are going to be more accepting of you than people who are not. And people with these labels will find themselves being sort of isolated in society and limited as to what they can and cannot achieve, which creates anger and frustration and ultimately creates that self-fulfilling prophecy. Well, if everybody thinks this and nobody will let me not be a criminal, I guess I'm a criminal. I guess I'll be more of a criminal, right? If I can't get legitimate employment, I guess I'll have to be a drug dealer to make money. And that's the argument behind labeling theory. That consistent negative feedback causes people to throw in the towel. The second theorist under labeling theory that we're going to discuss is a guy named Becker. And Becker wrote his original piece, The Outsiders, which is a scholarly piece of research that actually gave birth to the literary work, The Outsiders. Some of you may have read the book in your adolescence, or you may have seen the movie. And it is about a group of adolescents who are outsiders because they have the labels of criminal. But he argues that status, that label becomes your controlling status. You might be a spouse, a parent, a friend, a mother, a father, but if you are labeled criminal, all other elements of your life fade away under the weight of that label. And like I said, that labeling is going to limit service of debt paid back to society. That's the really frustrating thing under labeling theory, is that maybe you did do something wrong. Maybe you got arrested, you went to prison, you were convicted, you served your term, you paid your debt to society, but you'll never get rid of that label. That label is forever, right? There's also a lot of extra legal factors involved in labeling theory. So things like race and income and gender are going to dictate who's labeled and who's not, or who's more likely to be labeled versus who's not. This is a theory that is very weak in empirical support. It's very hard to find hard data to support it, but it's very strong in policy implications. The idea behind labeling theory is that we want to reduce interaction with the state, right? Reduce state intervention. That if we can focus on decriminalization, if we can focus on diversionary programs that keep you out of the system rather than in the system, if we focus on due process rights and laws, if we deinstitutionalize offenders and keep them in the community, that the labels will not be placed on the individual, and therefore there will not be the provocation of the self-fulfilling prophecy of further secondary deviance. So the idea here is when people engage in primary deviance and they come, whether it's adolescents or adults, and you come into contact with the system, we don't immediately throw the book at you. We say, okay, this is your first offense. We don't want to label you, which we know is just going to provoke more crime, right? Which is the antithesis of what we want to do. So what can we do with you? Well, let's divert you out of the system, and instead of probation or instead of being incarcerated, let's have you go into therapy and X, Y, and Z. Something that doesn't come with a heavy label of you've been sanctioned by the system formally that you are a criminal. Decriminalization is another attempt that there are certain lower level crimes that arguably don't cause a whole lot of harm to society. So let's decriminalize them. Let's change the definition and say this is no longer illegal, or maybe it's still illegal, but we just don't enforce the law against it, because then we'd be creating labels on people, right? And this is what we're seeing with marijuana, and it's state to state, but some states have decriminalized. Some states have legalized. Some states, I would even say some cities, like here in Pennsylvania and Harrisburg, it is decriminalized up to 1 ounce. And that is a diversionary process that we don't want to bring people into the system, because it is a lower level offense that causes minor harm. But once you're in the system, a criminal is a criminal is a criminal. People aren't really interested in how low level your offense was. They're just interested in the fact that you were involved in the system, and therefore you get the weight of that label, and it provokes secondary deviance. So diversion examples would be get them into treatment programs rather than incarceration. Go to AA, go to Narcotics Anonymous. Job training is another good diversionary method that is really pro-social. And then, of course, deinstitutionalization, rather than saying, okay, hey, you're going to juvie. No, let's keep them out of the formal system and see what we can do that will not result in labeling. So that's where we're going to stop for here, but there is going to be another lecture that follows this, and we are going to talk about reintegrative shaming, which is sort of a modern day labeling. So I will see you shortly.